In Oklahoma, working a full-time job isn't enough to guarantee housing. 2 out of 3 of the most common jobs don't pay enough to cover rent, and seniors and people with disabilities are being priced out of housing entirely. In fact, OK Policy and Together Oklahoma have been talking to Oklahomans about the biggest issues they face, and in every community we've visited, there's one sentiment that comes up everywhere: rent is too dang high. So, here to break down this important issue and what's going on in Oklahoma and what we can do about it is OK Policy's Senior Policy Analyst on Housing Issues, Sabine Brown. Thank you so much for being here with us today. So, you recently wrote about a new national report that sheds some light on the state of affordable housing in Oklahoma. Can you tell us a little bit about the report and what it showed? Like, how much does an Oklahoma worker actually need to work or earn and able to afford rent?
Yeah, so the Out of Reach report is an annual report put out by the National Low Income Housing Coalition to shed light on the disparity between wages and housing costs. And this is especially important in Oklahoma, where we hear a lot about low housing costs. We're actually ranked 42nd for our housing wage. But it's really important to remember that Oklahoma workers are paid really low wages, and we also have really high poverty. So we may have low housing costs, but our wages are not keeping up with housing costs despite them being low. So some important numbers from this report. Fair market rent for a 1-bedroom rental in Oklahoma is $876. For a 2-bedroom, it's $1,091. For a worker to spend no more than 30% of their income on housing, which is the recommended, so you have enough money to pay your other bills, you would need to get paid $16.85 to afford a 1-bedroom rental, or $20.98 to afford a 2-bedroom rental. So it's recommended that folks spend no more than 30% of their income on housing. And the reason for that is, while housing is one of our most important expenses that we have, it's not the only one. So the 30% is to leave enough money left over for folks to afford other life necessities like food and transportation and prescription medication. It's also intended to give a buffer. So that if something unexpected happens, like you have a medical emergency or your car breaks down, that you have enough in your budget to cover that. But unfortunately, a lot of folks in Oklahoma don't have that buffer, and they're spending way more than they should on housing, which means that if something unexpected happens, like they have a kid that gets sick and they have a high medical bill, or their car breaks down, they need to get that fixed. Sometimes that's a choice between taking care of those things or paying your rent. So we have a lot of folks that aren't able to absorb those kind of emergencies, and something unexpected really can put them on the brink of eviction or even homelessness.
And so why is affordable rent so important for all Oklahomans?
It's important because a lot of Oklahomans rent their home. 1 in 3 Oklahomans rent. That is about what it is nationally, but that number is growing. We're seeing a trend of more people renting their home. 1, just because home ownership is out of reach, and 2, just because of lifestyle choices. Some folks just prefer to rent and not have the upkeep and maintenance of a home. But rent is not as stable as a home mortgage. When you get a home mortgage, you pretty much know what you're going to be paying monthly from year to year. But as we're seeing, rent can increase rapidly year over year, and that can really quickly push people into housing insecurity, eviction, and homelessness. So this is an issue that we really need to be looking at closely because it is affecting a large number of Oklahomans.
And something that was really eye-popping to me was how many hours per week a minimum wage worker would have to clock in order to afford a 1 or 2-bedroom rental. Did that surprise you as well?
Absolutely. So the minimum wage has been $7.25 since 2009. And we know that is woefully inadequate to afford housing in Oklahoma. So to afford a one-bedroom rental in Oklahoma, a minimum wage worker would need to work 93 hours per week, or 116 hours per week to afford a two-bedroom. So that's nearly the equivalent of 3 full-time jobs, which is, virtually impossible. If you're wanting to, go to school or do any sort of career advancement, that's really hard to do when you're having that many hours needed just to keep a roof over your head. And especially for like single caregivers, if you're, a single parent trying to take care of your child, it's virtually impossible to work the amount of hours that are required to afford housing. Rent has risen 60% since the last time we raised the minimum wage. That disparity is going to continue to get worse if we don't address these low wages and rising housing costs.
So given that Oklahoma is a relatively poor state, last census data showed that we were the 6th highest in terms of poverty. Is housing even in reach for most residents, especially those who aren't even earning a living wage?
Yeah, it really isn't. I mean, we know that minimum wage workers are struggling to afford housing, but it's not just minimum wage workers that are struggling. This report looked at the 30 most common professions in Oklahoma and compared what they pay to the housing wage. And what it showed is that 2 out of 3 of the most common jobs in Oklahoma don't pay enough to afford even a modest 2-bedroom rental. And that includes jobs that I think most people would consider pretty solid jobs. It includes things like home health aide, customer service representative, administrative assistant, even construction workers. So all in all, about half of Oklahoma renter households aren't making enough to comfortably afford a modest 2-bedroom rental.
And so that's for people who have the option to get extra jobs, earn extra wages. So I'm thinking too about people who are on fixed incomes. I know there are many Oklahomans who receive supplemental security income or SSSI or Social Security benefits. What does this report say about housing affordability for seniors and Oklahomans with disabilities who receive SSI? I mean, how is rent affordable for them?
Yeah. It really isn't. Seniors and folks with disabilities are really, really hurting in this housing crisis. So the average Social Security payment is a little over $1,000. So affordable rent, again, not going over that 30% for somebody who is relying on Social Security income would be a little over $300 per month. But even a studio apartment is around $800 a month. So that leaves almost nothing to cover all your other life expenses, to cover food, transportation, prescription medication. And, we can't ask seniors to downsize from a studio apartment. The only choices for somebody in that situation that's struggling would be to, move in with friends or family, or they're facing homelessness or eviction. And unfortunately, that is a really disturbing trend that we're seeing, that seniors are the fastest growing segment of the homeless population. So seniors and people with disabilities really need some policy solutions quickly to make sure that they are able to stay in housing.
So a couple of years ago, the state legislature set aside some money to be able to address the affordable housing crisis in Oklahoma. Can you tell us a little bit about what that initiative was and kind of give us an update on how that's going?
Yeah. A couple of years ago, Oklahoma made a significant investment in workforce housing. So they appropriated $215 million towards workforce housing. So not the lowest income, but kind of in the middle. And that was the largest investment in state history into housing. So that was an amazing step forward, but we know that that's a drop in the bucket of what we need. All in all, we need about 85,000 units to meet the needs of extremely low income renters. So we know we need more investments and more policy solutions to keep people housed that are the most vulnerable to eviction and homelessness. We need investments that target housing for the lowest income families. And these families also need help immediately. And we're seeing federal cuts to rental subsidies that is going to affect a lot of our low income families. So another policy solution that Oklahoma could be looking into is building a state rental subsidy. So we know we need to build housing quickly for our lowest income folks, but people also need support now through things like rental subsidies and an eviction process that is fair and balanced.
The national group behind this report, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, also researched how the shortage of affordable housing in Oklahoma has changed over time. And you mentioned that we're tens of thousands of units short on affordable housing. So how has Oklahoma been able to make any progress, and how has it changed over the years?
Yeah. Right now, Oklahoma is short about 85,000 units for extremely low income families, and that is about 7,000 more than it was the previous year. So we know that gap is growing rather quickly. So again, that investment that we made in workforce housing was important, but we do need more investments targeted to lower income families. It is really hard right now for developers to build housing that is affordable for low income families. We all know that everything's gotten more expensive, and that includes the cost of lumber and supplies. We also have a labor shortage, which is contributing to rising costs, which is also likely to get worse with our current immigration policies and mass deportations. So to fill that gap, we really need governments to step in and help make that financially feasible for developers to build that kind of housing. We also know zoning makes it really hard to build affordable housing units. Most land nationally, as well as here in Oklahoma, is zoned exclusively for detached single-family homes. So that means that if you want to build a smaller home on a smaller lot, or some multifamily units like an apartment complex, duplexes, triplexes, there is really limited land for you to be able to do that. And when you find it, it is expensive because there is not a lot of land to build that kind of housing. So another policy solution that we should be looking at, which a lot of cities are exploring, is opening up more land for a diverse number of housing types. So again, including things like apartment complexes, duplexes, triplexes, or even just smaller lots with smaller homes that are more affordable for low-income families.
So for folks who have, either been directly impacted by the affordable housing crisis or are hearing the information that you're presenting here and wanting to take action, what are some of the things that everyday folks can do to be able to create the kind of change needed to address it? And what are some of the things that you would recommend folks do?
First of all, I would encourage everybody to talk to your state legislators about the importance of housing and how the lack of housing and the disparity between housing costs and wages is playing out in your community. Please tell your legislators about how the housing crisis is affecting your friends and neighbors. If you don't know who your legislator is, you can go to okpolicy.org to find that out. Now is a really great time for you to be talking to your legislators. They're out of session. They're in their communities, so now is a really great time to be talking to them so they can start thinking about legislation that they need to be proposing next year when they do go into session. Another thing that I would really encourage folks to do is get involved locally and start attending city council meetings and zoning board meetings. That sounds like a really boring thing to do, to go to a zoning board meeting, but it is one of the most impactful things that you can do. Like I mentioned earlier, it is really hard to find land to build affordable housing. And often when those things come up for a vote, a small number of people will come out and oppose it, and they don't always get a lot of support. So it doesn't take a whole lot of people coming out to a city council meeting or a zoning board meeting to really make a big difference in your community. Also, make sure that you're talking to your federal representatives. We know we're seeing massive threats to housing funding, to things like rental subsidies and money for homeless services. So make sure you're also talking to your representatives in DC about what housing means for you and your neighbors. And lastly, make sure that you are registered to vote and ready to get out and vote for state question 832 in 2026 when it comes up for a vote. This is a state question that will gradually increase our minimum wage and really help close that gap between wages and housing costs.
Sabine, thank you so much for talking to us about how we can keep roofs over Oklahomans' heads and reminding us that change is possible. It just takes all of us. That means calling your lawmakers, asking local officials to modernize zoning in your community, and making your voice heard at the ballot box, including State Question 832 to raise the minimum wage. You can find tools and resources, including the latest on housing issues from Sabine at okpolicy.org.